I'm Jude Kelly. I'm the Artistic Director of Ripples of Hope Festival. And I just wanted to say it's great on a Saturday morning that you've all turned up. That's human rights. That just demonstrates that you are totally dug into the idea of a better world. Otherwise, you'd be still getting up, wouldn't you, and listening to the radio and thinking, I wonder what happened today. This is Russ, and along with Sam, going to be signing in this room today, along with others. Thank you so much, Russ. Russ was signing last night for the first 10 poetic declarations, including signing for Linton Kwesi Johnson, which I think is quite something to put on your CV for definite. And actually, I don't know, I didn't think about the fact that you must have read the poems in advance. I'm just thinking, how did you sign? When he went, wah? What's the signing for wah? Okay. Because, those of you who weren't here to see Linton being absolutely amazing, you just look back on that poetry that he created in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and, he said, I wasn't prophetic. Anybody could have seen that it was going to be a ruckus, and, I just said there would be, and there was. But it really made me think about one of the subjects that we're going to discuss today, which is the art of protest and the role that art plays. It really made me think that now that there's a general admission that then there was racial injustice via the police, that all of those poems can be listened to probably at a police conference with a certain amount of equanimity, thinking, yes, in those days. But if the poems are written now, speaking of the racial injustice now, then of course that's a very different matter, and that's just too woke. And so, there is an issue, isn't there, about human rights that we've acquired often through the really hard battles that people have fought that have cost them a lot, their lives at worst, their reputations, their jobs, their friendship groups. It's, we are standing on the shoulders of people who gave such a lot in order that we've got the rights to sit on a Saturday morning discussing rights. And that doesn't just obviously include poets and writers, it includes all kinds of people who history will never acknowledge. But, the point of doing this Ripples of Hope Festival is to say that if you have the agency to sit somewhere reasonably solvent and reasonably safe, then you've also got the chance to make a change happen in your life and in other people's lives. And it's one version of what life's for. I just wanted to find out who was here yesterday in the daytime sessions. Could you just put your hand up if you were here yesterday? Okay, so would you mind if I did the same exercise that I did yesterday with this wider group? Is that all right? Because I don't want to look like I've only got one gig. But the thing is that it is us for today. There's obviously lots and lots of other people online. There's people joining us later in the day. But for those of you who were able to kind of come and think, well, I'll go into. For some people, this is the first time they've actually done anything in public since COVID hit, and so we're really grateful for people like turning up and being here in the flesh. But there are many other people being streamed in as well. And this is an exercise basically that just to acknowledge that we're in the room together and we don't know each other. How could we? And what's different about us and what's the same? The title of this festival, Ripples of Hope, comes from the quote from Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy. You know that this festival stems from the Robert F. Kennedy Foundation. The quote is this: every time a person stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, they send forth a tiny ripple of hope. And, it's sometimes so overwhelming to think about what can we do. And sometimes your ego can get involved, can't it? And you can kind of think, what can I do? You think, well, maybe I don't need to do that much. I can just do a little thing. And it all will mount up. If I stop thinking I've got to solve it and just think, well, we collectively can and we'll do our bit. So yesterday, for those of you who were in the session about Afghanistan, anybody was in that session? I mean, that was tough, wasn't it? Because Mazia, who is a judge in Afghanistan, well, no longer practicing in Afghanistan. She had to come into exile here about 10 years ago. She literally took out her mobile phone and the microphone, and she phoned Kabul, and she put the microphone to the receiver, and a woman judge in hiding in Kabul spoke to us all and said, I'm terrified of my life, we have no protection, the Taliban are roaming looking for us, please ask the British government to do something, what can we do? And she talked for a while, and then she said at the end, and I'm basically sitting here waiting to be killed. And none of us knew how to deal with that. We just had to understand that for her even to be able to know that her voice was heard by us, whatever happens, and who knows, was some element of hope. You know, we were there to witness her, and she knew we were there. It was a really difficult moment to experience, and I don't want it to be one of those things where people go, God, that was a great moment in the festival, wasn't it? Do you know what I mean? That would be horrific to sort of think of it as that. But it does show you that it matters to sit in rooms and think about how we can connect around the world. And it is only there but for the grace of fate or whatever you believe in that, you know, we're not in hiding waiting for something to happen. You just never know. During the day, try and, you know, talk to people who you don't know, because you never know what that might produce. And obviously we're all shy, but, you know, it's worth finding out why other people are here. You will have your own reasons. But I was just going to do this little exercise just because it's interesting to see who is in the room. And it's called Stand If. And it's not threatening. It won't break through any boundaries that you would be unhappy with, I promise. However, could you stand if you have a cat? Okay, and you can put the lights up on the audience. We'd just like to have a look at them. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Could you stand if you have a dog? Okay. Thank you. Come and sit down. We're just in the middle of doing something, but it's not going to frighten you. Could you stand if you have another pet of another kind? Okay, what's that? What have you got? Goldfish. A goldfish. 15 goldfish. Okay, so now that's a conversation you can strike up with somebody. As in, 27 goldfish. Okay, stand if you wouldn't dream of having a pet. Okay, here's people who won't have pets. Just single them out and look at them. Okay, thank you. Can you stand if you take photographs of your food? Okay, all right. Have you taken them in? You can, okay, could you, thank you. Stand if you think that's a ridiculous idea and you wouldn't dream of being caught dead taking photographs of your food. Okay, now we're not going to have a session on this, but okay, so there we are, the polarization of the food photograph groups. Could you stand if your great-grandparents or your grandparents are from another country? Thank you. Could you stand if you are ever thinking a lot more than you'd like to do about money? Thank you. Could you stand if you have ever been bullied or bullied? By the way, I'm standing for all of this, except the goldfish bit. Thank you. Could you stand if you or anybody in your friendship or family group or your immediate community have had a relationship with suicide? Okay, that's more people than have stood for anything so far. Thank you. Could you stand if you have a prejudice that has made you act thoughtlessly or cruelly? Thank you. Could you stand if you feel you do not have any prejudices? It's a bit of a dare, that one, isn't it, really? But, yeah. That's what I'm interested in for myself, what are my blind spots and what are the ones that I kind of know exist and I don't really want to have to deal with them yet. Could you stand if you would call yourself a leader? Thank you. Could you stand if you or anybody in your family or your friendship group or your immediate community have mental health issues? Could you sit if you would feel that that brings shame and you wouldn't talk about it? Okay, that's significant, isn't it? Look, everybody's still standing. So sit down again. Could you take a question that is similar? Could you stand if you or your friendship group, your family, or anybody in your community has suffered sexual trauma? Could you stay standing if you feel this is something that you're not going to be asked to do this? Could you stay standing, though, if in a circumstances that was appropriate, you think, well, I could talk about that easily? Okay, so that is significant. So about half the people have sat down again. So I just wanted us to note that, the certainty that we can talk about mental health and the clarity that we can't broach lots of issues to do with sexual trauma yet. Okay, finally, and thank you, could you stand if you believe that you are as kind to yourself as you should be? Okay, now those are 4 people. Oh, if you're sitting down, you're not sure. A bit more work to do. Okay, so let's have a look at those people. Now, again, I think go and have a chat with them. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, we don't know each other's names. What we can say from that is that everybody has different experiences, life experiences, friendship and circle group differences. There's so many things that we're still dealing with, And the whole point about this festival is it's not a festival of certainty. Glenn Maxwell last night did it wasn't exactly the human right to doubt, but it was sort of in the territory of, you don't have to know. And in fact, if you do know everything, then maybe you're dead. So how do we keep journeying forward? Today, there's a wall out there, which Julia and Jill come on stage are putting together, where any thoughts, rants, ideas you've got you can just put them there. Do you want to just say?
Sure. Hi, so the Making a Difference wall is a place where we're going to be gathering your thoughts, your fears, your pledges, your rants.
Yeah, we're in the foyer. Please come and talk to us. We had some great conversations yesterday, and the wall is building over the next couple of days. So, yeah, we'd really like to hear from you.
And they're great artists, and they'll just take your ideas and thoughts, etc., and they'll turn them into something you think, oh, I did that. You won't have done, but you'll make them feel that they did. It's really a lovely, lovely thing that you're doing, so thank you very much. Thank you. Obviously, we've got lots of people who've helped this festival happen. There they all are written up. So thank you to them all for making it possible. There are a couple of things I want to draw your attention to. There's the Walk of Peace. If you want to go on a tour of Manchester's Peace Trail, you'll find that in your Saturday book. You meet by the Engels statue. And there's the Human Library, where if you want to go and talk to people who have lived experience which needs to be discussed in a thoughtful and safe environment, then you can book in to, if you like, take somebody out who's offered to be in the human library. Your wristbands takes you into everything, go to all the different sessions, etc. The most important thing, really, I think, is that we all look after each other and kind of recognise, as we've just done, that we have different backgrounds and different experiences, and we don't have to all agree with each other about everything either. Helena Kennedy yesterday gave a fantastic history of the way that the Declaration was created, after the Second World War, which was unbelievably barbaric and unbelievably high-tech in its ability to deliver technology. It was such a terrifying issue, the Second World War, and not just the Holocaust, but also the many millions of Russians that were destroyed by Stalin, and Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I mean, the combination of everything was just so extreme that Eleanor Roosevelt brought together people from literally all over the world. It wasn't just sort of a Western idea. She brought together philosophers and religious leaders and people from across the world to create these 30 rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, enshrined in law. And we are always at a stage when rights that we think are certain, we suddenly think, I see they're conditional. The right to respect and dignity, everybody's rights, well, we can think of many places around the world where that is not the case, just the number one right. So it's something for us to kind of feel fueled up about. You don't have to have any academic language or know anything about law or even anything about the kind of the detail of rights. But you wouldn't be here if you didn't want to find out more and do more. And that's, a really exciting place to be. So we're going to start this morning. We're very, very grateful that Gary Younge has come to join us to kind of start the day with a reflection on the idea of equity, of justice, of respect, of what are we trying to grapple towards, and what are the barriers to that. I'm sure you know him, but if you don't, he's an award-winning author, he's a broadcaster, he's an academic. He was formerly a columnist at The Guardian. I know a lot of people have read his work over many years. He's a professor of sociology at Manchester University, so that's lucky for us all. He's also the Alfred Nobler Fellow for Type Media in America. He's written 5 books, including Another Day in the Death of America. He's going to give his talk, lecture, keynote, however you want to describe it, and then I'll ask him a couple of questions as a kind of start for 10, so that you can then ask him questions. Can you please welcome Gary Younge?
Thank you. Thank you, Jude, and welcome. As a child, my mum used to put on the song Young, Gifted and Black by Bob and Marcia, put my feet on hers, and then dance us both around the living room. They're playing our song, she'd say. It was the early 70s. She was barely 30, and I was the youngest of 3 children that she was raising alone. There was no evidence for her optimism at that time in a country where racism was on the rise and the economy was in the tank. So we danced around the living room, singing ourselves up, imagining a world in which we would thrive, for which we had no evidence, but great expectations. My mum died young. She was 44. I was 19. And my presence on this stage, on the pages of a national newspaper, as a professor and an author, would have been, I think, as unlikely as anything she hoped for that I might have achieved as a child as we padded around our living room. Yet her need to believe in the unlikely, the improbable, the fantastic, was vital precisely because it was necessary. Back in the early 70s in Stevenage, where I grew up, there was no evidence that we could or would break through the barriers that clearly existed and persist. But it was essential that even as she ploughed on, that she refused to believe her own eyes, to insist on a future for herself and her children that was, as yet, not apparent. And here I am. This is not a Horatio Alger story of personal uplift, taut bootstraps and rugged individualism. This is not ultimately about me or her. No amount of self-image reinforcement could have defied the odds that I faced. The route I took was paved by others whom I don't know and mostly have never met. Karl Marx, in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, wrote, men, one must assume he knew they were women too, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. I came into journalism thanks to a bursary from The Guardian. Those bursaries were The Guardian's response to the uprisings among black youth in the 80s, when black people were always in the news, but rarely in the newsrooms. The Scott Trust, which owns The Guardian, wanted to offer a correction, and so gave bursaries to underrepresented groups in journalism. And without it, I would have chosen another profession. I got my column in 1999, the year the Macpherson report into the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence made the concept of institutional racism mainstream. That was the year that Yasmin Alibhai-Brown's column appeared in The Independent, that my first book was published, Steve McQueen won the Turner Prize. The year before, Chris Ofili won the Turner Prize. The year after, Zadie Smith's White Teeth came out. Now, the relationship between these events was not causal, but contextual. It was the youth who took to the streets, the bereaved families who took to the courts, campaigners who ran in elections and stood in the rain and swam uptide through waves of indifference and hostility, who made me and others like me possible. This detracts not one iota from the creative abilities or hard work that made the success to which I refer. Only, I think, the privileged and naive believe that people's achievements are purely the product of their own genius. It simply acknowledges that there have been others who are similarly or were similarly able and hardworking for whom space had not been cleared. If I was talking about me, you could dismiss all that as faux humility, but I'm not. I'm talking about struggle, progress, and collective ambition. It's relatively easy to fight for the people you know, but they didn't know me, but they paid for me already. Similarly, the fact that we can't see the world we want to create doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for it. An example. When gay marriage was waved through the American courts around 7 years ago, I spoke to 72-year-old Madeline Davis, who spoke at the Democratic National Convention in 1972. Davis was from a small gay liberation organization in upstate New York, and they decided in that year, as an act of bravery and outrageousness, to run a delegate to the Democratic Convention, and they won. At the convention, she made the case for basic legal protections for gay equality. Her proposal was summarily defeated after the delegate that followed her, at a Democratic convention, mind you, drew parallels between homosexuality, pedophilia, and prostitution. She told me, we knew we were at the beginning of something and had a huge task ahead of us. Back then, we were trying to stop people from being kicked out of their jobs and harassed on the street. We knew we couldn't stop at the convention. We dedicated our lives to moving this thing along. It never occurred to us at the time that gay marriage was even possible. And so it was a decade ago that the media referred to the advent of gay marriage as though it was inevitable, an idea, they said, whose time had come, without acknowledging that its arrival was not the product of time and tide, but because it was fought for, even when it was unlikely, by people who did not even believe it was possible. They fought not because victory was plausible, but because not fighting ensured defeat. Davis told me, people forget that this did not erupt wholly from the head of Zeus. It did have a foundation. Those of us who did hard work all over the country did put in many days and many hours going through rejection. What is true for gay equality is no less true for human rights, civil and disability rights, female suffrage, the 8-hour working day, all the way up to democracy itself. We owe our rights to people like Davis, who are outrageous and brave enough to fight for a society they insist upon, even if they cannot quite fathom how it might materialize. Politics, pragmatists tell us, quoting Bismarck, is the art of the possible. But radicalism must demand the capacity to imagine other possibilities. One only has to imagine that Martin Luther King in 1963 had climbed to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and didn't say he had a dream, but instead announced a 5-point plan. A proposal that he thought he could both sell to the black community and win a majority for in both houses of Congress that would bring civil rights legislation just that one step closer. Now, don't get me wrong, there could have been some immediate merit to that. To be pivotal in the movement for progressive social change, we have to position ourselves where we think we can make a difference and engage with the world as it is rather than as we would like it to be. Otherwise, all our dreams would have us sleepwalking into constant defeat. While we dream of our utopias, there are others with dystopias in mind. We spend a lot of time and effort convincing ourselves that another world is possible, but should never forget that a worse world is possible too, and there are people actively working towards it. So we have to be strategic and engaged, always mindful of the Brazilian radical Paulo Freire's premise or question that activists should ask themselves, what can we do today so that tomorrow we can do what we couldn't do today? But if we limit our thinking to the narrow confines of our time and place, then we effectively limit our horizons to our time and space. If we reduce ourselves to only what is possible, plausible, feasible, and available, then we forego the capacity to strive for what is necessary, fair, just, and desirable. Things change when we make them change. In the words of the abolitionist African-American Frederick Douglass, if there's no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are people who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Now, I believe this in part because if we look at so many things that have been achieved, it's clear that the foot soldiers of the movements in question, like Davis, never envisaged that so much space could be cleared and built on. I believe it in part because believing the alternative, that we are limited to what we can see politically, is too dispiriting. I believe it because I know our opponents believe it. Brexit, Donald Trump, Boris Johnson were all implausible ones, and yet here we are. But mostly, I believe it because from those days shuffling around to Bob and Marcia in my living room with my mother, I have been a product of that thinking. I was not possible, and yet here I am. I danced my way here to the music of my mother and on the feet of those who never knew me but imagined a world in which someone like me might be possible. Thank you.
Well, obviously that was great, and it was moving to think about your mum as well. Too early to go. Yeah. I was thinking as I was hearing you talk about the idea of dreams, about what you believe in terms of the final moment, and I'll tell you why. Because sometimes I'm a cisgendered white woman and I'm 67. So I've been trying to be a change maker all my life, and I'm only realizing that I'm mortal now. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I am not going to see equality before I die. That's a given. And of course, it was naive to think I would. But sometimes I ask women of all kinds, do you believe that we will be equal one day? And you know, lots of people don't put up their hands and say yes. And so I'm interested to know whether you, as a black man, believe that actually white entitlement will dissolve and that we will reach a point when there is absolute equality. You know, is that a dream you can grab onto and you can hold onto and you believe?
I guess so. I mean, one day is a very long time away. One day is also never, in a sense, and never has the benefit of being unattainable. But I believe stubbornly that human beings are up to the task. And so then I believe it's possible. I've never believed that I would see anything like it in my lifetime. But that, yes, but that these things are possible. And every now and then, I will catch a moment of something that was unthinkable when I was growing up. Something that people would have said, well, this is never going to happen. Actually, gay marriage being one of those things. And I think, well, yes, all sorts of things are possible. And that I think when things move, they move quickly, because there are, and we've seen this over the last few years, these latent constituencies who are ready. So, Black Lives Matter, it's not that more black people are being killed by the police in America, it's that we are conscientized to the fact that black people are being killed in America. So there were people waiting to be galvanized, and then there they were. One day they were sitting in, the next day they were out in the streets. And so things can move very, very quickly. But at the heart of it, for your question, I believe that human beings are up to the task. It's not every day that is an easy thing to sustain as a belief, but it is a core belief.
That's a really powerful idea, isn't it? Which you've got to really believe in humans and their capacity. You know, I sometimes say, you know, have a go at falling in love with humans more, because an awful lot of dystopian, you referred to a kind of dystopianism, which can be a philosophy, and a kind of method of segregating people, not just by the conventional methods of oppression, but actually by the idea that, like, we don't have to let people count, and we don't even have to like humans that much, except for our friends group. So that ability to think that humans are up for it, bearing in mind the fact that you've witnessed deep, wicked things, you know, it's just not just like individual acts, but like deliberately driven into the way that society is organized. Why have you remained on humans' side?
Well, first of all, the alternative is too bleak. And secondly, and there is something of my upbringing in this. I grew up in Stevenage, in an overwhelmingly white town, where quite often the people who were shouting racist abuse at you one day were asking my mum if they could help their kid with their math the next day. And that I came to understand that people weren't just one thing. I'm not there's anything wrong with this, but I'm not a Christian. I don't, you know, and I'm not a pacifist. I don't have any of that kind of very reasonable stuff in me. But I've seen people grow. I've grown myself, and I've seen the way that people can be more than one thing, quite often even at the same time. And so yeah. So and to be honest, the alternative, you only get one life, and there are a few things that my mother's death taught me, but one was you only get one life, and it's short, and you don't know when it's going to go. So I could either live my life thinking people are bad, and there's a lot of things that flow from that. Big walls, big gates, gated communities, clutching your bag, all that. Or I could go out thinking that people are basically good. And that is my choice. And that's the choice I make.
Mm. It's interesting that, isn't it, that you can choose to believe in good. You can choose to do that and let the things that flow from that. I've got one more question, and I'm doing that so that you now know that it's your turn, so you don't have that gap for me where you can think, oh, have I got a question? I don't know. So while you're thinking yours up, and it was really to do with what I said earlier about watching Linton last night. You know, he read 3 poems, and you know, we're in a situation at the moment when people much prefer, they're happy to have radicalism, they're happy to have had Martin Luther King speak on behalf of everybody because he's dead and it's over. But the idea of people rioting now is, you know, it's beyond the pale. So this idea of caring for people and wanting to listen to all opinions and etc. But there does come a point, doesn't there, when you have to be able to say, actually, you're not hearing me, so we can do an alternative action. And that is always, I think, the moment when, if you like, people get completely confused because really they want without struggle. They want it to happen without struggle.
Yeah, so that was the point of my Frederick Douglass quote, that kind of the forces that made a range of things possible, including me, wasn't people asking nicely.
Yeah.
People didn't actually like Martin Luther King much when he was alive, actually. 2/3 of people in the last poll before he died thought he was a bad thing for American race relations. They didn't want the March on Washington to take place where he delivered the I Have a Dream thing. But actually, in the moment, change is hard. It freaks people out. And if you're talking about equality, then I believe that we all benefit from more equality, but that does mean some people giving some things up in order to gain other things, and sometimes all they can see is the things that they're giving up. So in the moment, people can get very freaked out. Now, I know that this, and I really don't want to descend into a general conversation about this thing, but I do think that there is a recent lesson in Britain, to me, which was Corbyn. That Corbyn made people very uncomfortable, and people kind of, they thought he was kind of wild and crazy and all that kind of stuff. And then he's gone, and some of the same people who, you know, found him very troubling are saying, well, we need more money for care homes, and we need more money for this, and we need more money for that. And it's like, yeah, we do. And these things are hard. And when the person comes along, when someone comes along who advocates for those things, you're probably not gonna see that unless you kind of open your eyes and your ears to it. So change is hard, and people aren't always up for it. And there are an army of scaremongers out there. Yeah. I'm not talking about Corbyn anymore, so everybody can put your weapons down. There are an army of scaremongers out there who deliberately, willingly, gleefully appeal to the notion that human beings are bad.
Yes.
And, you know, that's what we're up against.
Yeah. I mean, all my life, I've grown up with a phrase that I can hear about Rhodesia, about South Africa, about gay rights, about women's rights, about disabled rights, which is, if we're not careful, then, you know, is going to happen. And it's the realization that people are going, right, well, let's plan to be very careful, which means we'll pull the rights back as far as we can get them. And I think naively, sometimes I think, well, they won't be doing that on a daily basis, but of course they are doing it in a very organized way.
And there's a kind of there's a weirdness of a kind of, you know, a whataboutery about this stuff, where I remember as gay marriage saying, like, you know, well, what next if gay people, what about if 2 dogs want to get married? And it's like, you know what, we'll deal with that when it happens. Like, when two dogs turn up at a registry office, I ask to get married, then why don't we just deal with this? It's a bit like when people say, I don't care, and it's nearly always white people who say this. I don't care if someone's black, white, yellow with pink spots. It's like, look, we have enough trouble with black and white people. You don't need to invent new people with spots and polka dots and all the rest
Spotty
of
ones are awful, aren't they?
And
The
so
stripy ones are worse.
the kind of the water battery, what next? And sometimes it's, quite often it's very revealing about what they're actually, what they're actually afraid of. In the case of, well, what if two dogs get married? They think that gay people are like dogs. Well, then just say that and then have that conversation.
Yeah. Okay, could we put the lights up on the audience? Thank you, and I think we've got microphones. So who would like to ask a question, make a point? Okay, just, there's a micro, there, thank you. Somebody here?
Hi there.
Thank you. So you touched on the issues of police against black people in America. Do you have any thoughts about how we can raise our voices and bring to a large platform the issues around that are happening even in Manchester now with black people and their treatment at the hands of the police here? I have particular concerns about our new police commissioner and also the recent campaign about no police in schools, which, is creating this pipeline of criminalising young people, which leads to potentially criminalising, in particular, black youth and youths of colour in the school system, as opposed to creating a fostering educational experience.
I do in a very broad sense, and there are two things I'd say. One is a personal experience of this, because I lived in America for 12 years, and my son started school in Chicago, where every school has a cop. And I was actually kind of freaked out the first time I went to school, and the first person I saw at the school, my kid's 4 or 5 at the time, 5, was a man with a gun. I'm like, my kid shouldn't be around anyone with a gun at 5. I mean, ever, but how odd. And there were a few things that kind of stem from that. The first is that most of the kids aged between 16 and 19 who are arrested in Chicago are arrested at school. And they're arrested for fighting, for doing stuff that kids might do that are not arrestable. The other thing was that in my kids' school, the kids would sometimes, even in kindergarten, be sent to the cop if they were like messing about, stamping their feet. And when you said, I'm not good with that, which we did, they said, well, it's only Mr., I think his name was Gutierrez or something, it was a Latino guy. It's not like we called 911, which is 999 there. And I said, well, you don't have to, because the cops are in the school. If he, pulls a gun on someone, send him to the cop. If he pinches somebody's candy bar, deal with it. And I said to my wife, who's American, because we made a representation to the school, I want to know why there are cops in the school. And it's a good example of this difference between the incremental, if you like, and the bigger vision. Because she said, that's a good question, and it's a fair question, and nobody here is asking that question. What we strategically have to do right now is ask the school what the policy is, and then fight them on the policy. But if you want to go ahead, which I didn't, and have a broader thing, then I would support you in that. All of which is to confirm that thing of dystopias. Other people are thinking of this awful world in which we might live. And then in particular, I think that, I don't have anything particularly original to say, apart from that we have to be organized. We have to be organized, and we need to build coalitions with other people, and we need to educate. Because I wasn't raised to think that policemen were there to show me directions and, to get cats out of trees or whatever. I wasn't. I was raised to think that they might do me harm. But not everybody was raised like that. And so it's an education to them that we have to give to, look, this is how things stand. This is where things are. This is what we could achieve. And it should be noted that these are not pie-in-the-sky notions. They have been achieved. I would finally say that while there is some use in transferring some of the things that they've done in America to here, it's of limited use because the notion of policing is somewhat different. Everything in America is more lethal, including racism, and the relationship between local people, democracy, and the police is different. And so this is not something that we can just shift wholesale from one context to another. It will be a British response, and probably a far more local response than that. Manchester's not London, and my guess is that kind of Liverpool is, again, very different.
Thank you. I think my main issue with it is the fact that it's happening already in Manchester, and so few people, so few parents I speak to know that there is this sort of infiltration of the police into the schooling system in our city. And I was aware of it because the Kids of Colour campaign, but I'm also aware that it's something that so few people talk about, and it's something that really scares me about my nieces and my nephews, and, you know, just generally our society and the direction it's going in. But thank you for your comments.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point because I didn't know that police were being introduced in schools in Manchester. I'm not from Manchester. But it is an interesting point about when something happens that you could just say is a local decision. But in a democracy where a local decision can end up being a test bed for something which can get then rolled out, and people go, well, we tried it in Manchester, it was really good. Like, when do we ever discuss it? So I think it's an important thing to have raised. Thank you. Anybody else? One here?
Hello, Gary.
Hi there.
I want to talk about tribal signatures and the future of tribal signatures in relation to this city, because we have these yellow and black stripes everywhere, and it's called the Hacienda sign.
Can you hear that? Tribal signatures. Yeah.
And where I am in my thinking is about Afrofuturism, the notion of the capitalisation of black culture and the black economic of realities, in a sense. But what I want to know is what is the future tribal signature? Is it yellow and black spots? Is it stripy? Is it zebra shaped? Or is it something else? And what have we got to do to achieve that utopia, in a sense?
Can you just educate me about what you mean by tribal signatures?
Tribal signatures are...
I first thought you meant tribal. I heard tribal sandwiches first of all.
They're nice.
Sounds like it might be quite nice. Sorry.
Tribal signatures are something we've all grown up with in a popular sense, in relation to the clothing we wear, the style we take when we go and dance. When you mention your Marcia dancing routine with your mother, that signature is constant within black cultures and Asian culture and English culture in the wider sense. So where we are in a realm of, say, sci-fi, Afrofuturistic, the city of Manchester, which identifies strongly with the black and yellow stripes of the Hacienda, which have now been converted into the tram system, tram colours, and the future of the buses in the city as well. Where are we in the future in relation to the kind of realities of where we're going? How can we contextualise the future tribal signatures to take us through this period of mourning, grieving due to COVID, but also that futurism we all aspire to, in a sense?
So I'm not sure I understand your question, and I know that I can't see the future. And I don't say that disparagingly. I mean that there is, in journalism, there was this very irritating thing where people thought that their job was to predict what would happen, as opposed to just describe what is happening. I'm going to have a stab of where I think you're coming from, which is that culture is a kind of, it's a pollinator. It's if you like, a fertilizer almost. And that things start with one group and they end up with another group. And so the notion, it's why I have real trouble when people start talking about cultural appropriation in a certain way, because I think, well, cultures are supposed to mix. That is actually what makes cultures live. Now, nobody can steal, nobody can claim that something is theirs that isn't, but that our future here is intimately, and here I'm talking about the number of mixed-race marriages, the prevalence of social housing, which puts us all together, the way that we are kind of educated, the fact that we didn't have segregation here. Our future is intimately tied up with each other. And so I don't feel like I have a future in Britain that is separate from white people, because it's not possible. Not that I want one, but it's actually not possible. One could imagine in America a real significantly larger autonomy for all groups, for better and for worse. But here, that's not how we do, and I'm mostly grateful for that. So I understand our future, the Afrofuturism that you refer to, as being intimately connected to other futures.
We've got time for one more question. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. My name's Lisa, and among other things, I'm the Vice Chair of Community Arts Northwest here in Manchester. You talked there about education, Gary, and yesterday education was mentioned several times, particularly the education around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in schools. Those of us who come from an arts background do understand about community cohesion and breaking down barriers through access to art and access to culture. In the education system, my understanding is that the government's either already cut or is cutting creativity from the curriculum. And teachers who I know are so frustrated about that. And we talk a lot about education, and I have no idea who sets the curriculum. I don't know who those people are. But how do you think that we can influence the curriculum in this country to be more inclusive around issues like Black history and around human rights? I think that is perhaps one of the core areas where we should be looking to make a difference. And how can we do that? How can we shape that, do you think?
So I guess there's a couple of things that I might contribute to what is already a kind of ongoing discussion. And the first is that we have to make things accessible. We have to make things... I do some volunteer teaching at my daughter's school. She's 8. And with the year 3s and year 4s, so 7, 8, 9, we're doing diaspora. And so I start with, who's got family from somewhere else? And then we get the map out and we put the dots on and we draw some flags and all that. And then I say, okay, your homework is to go home and ask your parents where else you got family from. And then they come back and we have more dots and more flags. And then from there, we talk about how they got there. And then finally we get to Windrush. Because there is some kind of connection to it. And I get frustrated when I live in Hackney, and when they're doing Black History Month, and they're doing the Mary Seacole thing, and and I'm like, that's fine, but you know that Hackney elected the first Black woman in Parliament. She's still in Parliament. Some of these kids' parents probably campaigned for her. Why don't you get them in to talk about that as being history? And from there finally we can get onto the other things. But so often they make it sort of abstract and leadery. So it's like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, and kids look at that and they think, well, I'm never going to fucking be that. Do you know what I mean? So then I might as well, if that's what it means to make history, then, so the idea that ordinary people make history, that you make history, that your parents made history, that you are part of history, as opposed to history is something that happens to you and that you read about in books. You know, in the school we're at, there's a, I started by talking to them. I started by talking to them about people I've interviewed that they might have heard of and some that they haven't heard of. And basically, the only person that I've interviewed that they've heard of is Stormzy, and everybody else they haven't. And so, so then I mentioned Maya Angelou, and they're like, and there's a picture of Maya Angelou on the wall. You can put all kinds of pictures that you want on the wall, but if you can't make it relevant to people, then it really doesn't matter. And we've got into a declaratory thing of announcements and posters and so on without actually kind of making a connection. That would be one thing. The second thing would be to draw on the cultures that exist. That this government is not for us, and it won't be for us. And we don't have to accept that. We should fight that. But in the meantime, the government in 1960 wasn't for us either. And yet they still did the Notting Hill Carnival. That the government wasn't for us when we, developed, or when Indian food exploded. It wasn't for us. It certainly wasn't for us with kind of Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League and all that kind of stuff. We have culture. The government can't give us. The government can't even make the bloody trains run on time. They can't. We have culture, and we need to draw from the cultures that we have, and it becomes particularly urgent in the moment when they are withdrawing it in other ways, because the cultures that we have are sustained and sustainable. They can't take that away. They can put things in, they can take things out of the curriculum, but they can't take away Claudia Jones, the struggle at Notting Hill, the anti-racist, the fight against it. They can't take that away. And so we have to understand our strength in that our culture is our strength. And that's everybody's culture. And the final thing I would say, and this in other hands, or maybe even in my hand, might be reactionary, is to insist on the fact that young white kids have culture too. There is a notion that culture happens to other people and that you don't have one. Well, you have culture too. And actually your culture, like I was saying before, is all mixed up with our culture, funnily enough, because we all live side by side. And that does irritate me when there is a sense of ethnic anything where everybody else is ethnic apart from white people. No, you have an ethnicity, you have a race, and actually I think it is the best response to the kind of racist horseshit that comes out of the government about, well, you're talking bad about poor white people. It's like, no, they're with us, they're not with you. Or at least they would be more with us if we invited them, if we had a language that included them.
Thank you. So Gary has set up lots of rivulets that will go through the day and, keep picking them up and churning them over, if I've just mixed the metaphors there. But Russ and Sam, thank you so much for signing. And I should have said this morning, of course, isn't it nice to be home at home? Such a lovely venue to be in, such a welcoming venue. You've got, I think, 15 minutes to go and get a cup of tea and talk to strangers, demand to know about why they're here and what pets they've got. And can I just say again, it's really wonderful to have been listening to Gary, not just his thoughts, but his feelings and his spirit. It's been a joy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.